Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Yeah.
Today we are taking you along on a really fascinating conversation between Joe Rogan and Michael Kosta.
Right.
We've got some amazing clips from their discussion on the Joe Rogan experience, and
As you
Joe
know,
Rogan experience can go anywhere.
yeah, Joe Rogan's conversations go all over the place, and today's deep dive really reflects that breadth. And lots of interesting perspectives to come.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Keep
Actually,
good.
we kind of plucked out some really interesting points that they touch on, whether it's the world of the comedy or sharing stories about these unexpected career shifts,
Yeah.
or diving into sports and all the rapid changes that are happening with technology.
Yeah.
So really interesting, and we are going to give you the essence of that without you having to listen to hours of content.
Exactly right. Our goal is to highlight the key takeaways, the really surprising moments from this conversation, things that might spark, new ways of thinking for you, the listener. So buckle up and get ready for a really fascinating deep dive.
Yeah, it's like those aha moments that
Oh,
you
gosh.
find
Hey,
that
let's...
really stick with you after you listen to something that is really thought-provoking,
Yeah.
and whether you are looking to just like broaden your understanding of a few different things or simply just enjoy listening to a thought-provoking conversation,
Right.
you are in the right place. So let's dive right in.
Let's get into it.
And we are going to start in the world of comedy.
Yeah.
And this is where they really kick off their conversation. And they were clearly both very energized by the topic of Jon Stewart's return to The Daily Show.
Yes, both Rogan and Kosta were really enthusiastic about Jon Stewart coming back. And what was interesting was their focus on Stewart's very particular brand of comedy. They really highlighted how he manages to blend such a sharp intellect with really genuine humor. It's like he can make you think and laugh at the same time.
And it's almost even more relevant now,
Oh, absolutely. In today's world where everything feels so polarized and intense, Stewart's ability to cut through the noise with intelligence and humor is more valuable than ever. It's like he's offering a sanity check through comedy.
Totally. And what's interesting, too, is that Costa, having worked with Stewart,
Right.
actually offers some interesting insight into the creative environment behind the scenes.
It's like getting a peek behind the curtain of The Daily Show. Costa described the writer's room as this really dynamic space. There's this constant exchange of ideas. They're bouncing things off each other, considering different angles, and then suddenly they'll pivot to something completely ridiculous. It's a really cool blend of high-level discussion and just pure comedic silliness.
I love that.
It really gives you a sense of how those jokes come together, how they find humor in the unexpected, and Costa's description of the writing process really emphasized that collaborative spirit. It's not just one person dictating the jokes, it's a team effort.
Right. And it kind of
It's like a jam session for comedy minds.
it highlights the fact that comedy can operate on so many levels at the same time.
Totally.
It can be deeply insightful, but also embrace that absurdity,
Yeah.
and it can kind of go back and forth.
Exactly. It's that balance that makes it so engaging, and it makes you think about how we often compartmentalize things in life, like seriousness versus humor, when in reality those lines can be blurred and often are in the most interesting ways.
Exactly. And it makes you think about how we relate to our own ideas as well.
Oh, that's a great point, because this ties into something they talked about, which is the idea that your ideas are not you. And I think that's such a crucial insight for anyone, whether you're in a creative field or not. It's about being able to detach from your ideas to evaluate them more objectively.
Right. And not getting so like defensive about them.
Exactly. Because when you're too attached to your ideas, you become less open to feedback and collaboration. But if you can separate your ego from your creations, it allows you to explore different possibilities and discard ideas without feeling like you're rejecting a part of yourself.
It's such a good point. And the way Costa describes the process of writing comedy
Yeah.
is so interesting. He compared it to mining for gold.
Oh, yeah, that's a great
It
analogy.
really gives you a clear picture.
Because you're sifting through a lot of dirt to find those little nuggets.
Yes. And he's like, you go through so much garbage to find those few gems of jokes.
And it's not just about the jokes, it's about everything in the creative process, right? It's about the writing, the editing, the performing. It all requires a lot of effort and a lot of what might seem like failures before you get to those golden moments.
Right, and you have to be willing to go through all that garbage to get there.
You have to embrace the garbage. It's part of the
Wow.
process. It's like a refining fire that helps you burn away the impurities and find the truly valuable stuff.
Exactly.
And this really connects to the notion of the muse.
Yeah.
You know, that magical source of inspiration that some people believe in, but they both kind of emphasize the more practical side of creativity.
Right.
You know, like you can't just wait for the muse to strike. You have to show up and do the work.
And put in the time.
Exactly. And they reference the book The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, which talks about this concept of resistance, you know,
Yeah.
that inner voice that tries to stop you from creating. And the key takeaway for you, the listener, is that you have to treat your creative endeavors like a profession,
Like a job.
right? You have to dedicate specific time to it, minimize distractions, and commit to the process, even when you don't feel like it.
And Kosta even said that, like, early on, he had a very specific routine. He would go to the same coffee shop every day and just write.
Yeah.
And he just put in the hours, and he talked about somebody at the Comedy Store, even noticing that he was always coming up with new material because of that dedication.
Right. It shows that consistency really pays off in any field, but especially in something as competitive as comedy. And it's not just about the quantity of material, it's about the quality that comes with that dedicated practice.
Right.
And it's interesting how they then shifted the conversation from, you know, the sort of internal world of the creative process to these often unpredictable paths that careers can take.
Yes.
They shared some really fascinating stories, like the one about this Egyptian guy who is working in finance.
Oh, yeah.
And he discovers this passion for making brisket in Austin, Texas later in life.
And he completely changes his life.
Yeah, he picks up and moves across the globe to pursue this newfound passion.
What a story.
It really makes you think about how those sparks of inspiration can come from unexpected places and how fulfilling it can be to pursue something you truly love, even if it means making big changes.
Yeah, it's like life can throw you a curveball.
Oh, absolutely. And sometimes those curveballs are the best things that can happen to you
Exactly.
because they force you to reassess your priorities and discover things you might have never known about yourself. And it's inspiring to hear about someone taking that leap of faith even later in life. It shows that it's never too late to reinvent yourself.
And then Rogan jumps in and he shares his own experience with,
Right.
choosing to go into comedy,
Yeah.
even though it meant making a lot less money than he was as a
Yeah.
tennis coach.
Yep. Yeah, that's a really interesting story because initially he was like, well, if I'm going to be broke anyway,
Right.
I might as well be doing something I love.
Right.
And it's that kind of thinking that often leads to really amazing things. You know, sometimes you have to take a risk and follow your heart, even if it means sacrificing some financial security in the short term.
And sometimes you have to just like be okay with the struggle.
Exactly. And the struggle often teaches you more than comfort ever could.
Right. And they talked about how, making those career changes later in life are
Yeah.
different than when you're younger.
Totally. When you're younger, you might have fewer responsibilities, less to lose. So taking a risk feels less daunting. But as you get older, you might have a mortgage, kids, other financial obligations that make that leap of faith a little bit harder.
Right.
But it's not impossible. And they brought up examples of comedians who have really found success later in their careers. Like Rodney Dangerfield didn't really take off until he was in his 40s.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
I know, right? And Schimmel, another comedian, didn't start until his mid-30s. So these stories are really encouraging for anyone who feels like they might have missed their chance
Yeah.
or that it's too late to pursue a new path.
It proves that it's never too late.
Never too late to follow your dreams. And Rogan even talked about how when he started comedy in his late 20s, he thought he was already behind.
Oh, wow.
I know it's funny to think about that now, considering how incredibly successful he's become, but it just shows that everyone's journey is different. And sometimes what feels like a late start can actually be the perfect timing.
Right.
And then Kosta brought up the Boston comedy scene
Oh, yeah.
and how unique and challenging it was.
Yeah, it was like a proving ground.
It really was. He talked about this really talented group of comedians in Boston who didn't necessarily have aspirations for national fame.
Yeah.
They were happy to hone their craft in this intense local environment.
It's so interesting. It was like this hidden gem of a comedy scene where these incredibly skilled comedians would battle it out night after night. And Kosta said that for comedians coming in from outside, it was a real trial by fire.
I got
Because the Boston audiences were known for being tough and discerning. So you really had to bring your A game if you wanted to make them laugh. And I think that kind of environment really shapes you as a comedian. It forces you to become sharper and more resilient.
And that kind of led naturally into a conversation about how comedy itself has evolved.
Right, because in the past you had these very polished, meticulously crafted acts.
Right.
And now there's this trend of comedians sharing their work in progress online, and both Rogan and Kosta kind of acknowledge there's this nostalgia for those older routines, the ones that were really tight and well rehearsed.
Yeah, like you would go to a comedy show and you knew you were getting like the finished product.
Yeah, exactly. And there was a certain artistry to that, but they also recognize that for younger comedians, the ability to share their material online and get instant feedback is an incredible tool. It allows them to experiment more, to iterate faster, and to build an audience more quickly.
Right, like it's accelerated the whole process.
Absolutely. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just reflects how the world is changing, and comedy has to adapt with it.
Exactly.
And it's not just the material itself that's evolving. It's also the culture surrounding comedy, like the green room,
Right.
the backstage area where the comedians hang out before and after their sets. Kosta told this really funny story about a club in Vancouver called Yuck Yucks, and how they actually had a sign up that said something like, "Don't harass anyone."
Oh my gosh.
It's hilarious, and in a way, it's kind of a sign of the times. There's this growing awareness of the need for respect and boundaries in all areas of life, including the comedy world.
Right.
And Rogan was talking about how back in the day, green rooms were these really wild places.
Right.
With a lot of like talking shit and just like really raw energy.
It's just like a different time.
It was a different time, and it's not that that kind of energy has disappeared entirely, but there's definitely been a shift towards a more regulated and respectful atmosphere.
Right.
And then, of course, the mention of Yuck Yucks in Vancouver led to a little bit of a dig at Canadian politeness.
Oh, of course.
Rogan and Kosta were joking about how Canadians are so rule-abiding and always apologizing.
Right.
It's a stereotype, but it's also kind of true.
Yeah.
And it's all in good fun, of course.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how those cultural differences can play out even in the comedy world.
Absolutely. And that made me think about how local references in comedy
Right.
can sometimes be really funny.
Yeah.
But it's also like, do they limit your appeal if you're trying to reach a wider audience?
That's a good question, because on the one hand, those local references can create a really strong connection with a specific audience they feel like, inside jokes that make people feel like they're part of something.
Right.
But on the other hand, if you're relying too heavily on those references, it can alienate people who aren't familiar with them. So it's a balancing act for comedians. They have to figure out how to be relatable to different audiences while still staying true to their own voice and experiences.
Totally. And then they kind of shifted gears and started talking about
What was it?
the world of like tennis and martial arts.
Oh, yeah.
And hell,
They're drawing this analogy.
those are such skill-based pursuits.
Right. They were comparing it to comedy.
Right. And they said that
It all requires practice.
practice is key
Absolutely.
to get better at anything.
Yeah.
You have to put in the time and the effort. And they used the example of this young tennis player, Andreeva, who they've both been watching.
Oh, yeah.
And they were commenting on how much she's improved in just a few years.
Amazing to see.
It really is. It's like a testament to the power of dedication and hard work. And it's not just about getting better in a general sense. It's about developing those subtle nuances that really separate the good from the great.
Right. And it's almost like a language that you start to understand
Right.
when you really immerse yourself in a skill.
Totally. And Kosta told this funny story about trying to explain
To his wife.
Yeah.
The intricacies of Djokovic's backhand to his wife.
and she just doesn't.
She couldn't grasp it.
Right.
And it's like that because she's not immersed in the world of tennis.
Right.
She doesn't understand the nuances, the subtleties that make that backhand so special. But to someone who plays or watches tennis at a high level, it's like poetry in motion.
It's so funny.
And it's a great illustration of how passion and expertise can really change the way you see the world. You start to notice things that others might miss, and it's not limited to sports. It applies to anything you dedicate yourself to, whether it's music, art, or even something like cooking.
And then they kind of got more into their shared passion for tennis.
Right.
And Kosta talked about how he used to kind of shy away from his tennis background.
When he was doing comedy.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, like he didn't really want people to know.
Right, because I guess he thought it might not fit the image of a comedian.
But now he's like fully embracing it.
Exactly. And he even wrote a book about his experiences called Lucky Loser.
I love that title.
It's a great title, and it really reflects his journey of embracing all the different parts of himself. And he talked about how the skills he learned in tennis, like discipline and handling wins and losses on your own, have been incredibly valuable in his comedy career.
Because comedy can be a very solitary pursuit.
Exactly. You're up there on stage by yourself, and you have to be able to deal with the pressure and the uncertainty. And Kosta's tennis background really prepared him for that.
It's fascinating.
And then they told this amazing story about Freeway Ricky Ross.
Oh my gosh, what a story.
It's incredible. This guy was a talented tennis player from South Central LA, and despite being illiterate, he became a very successful cocaine dealer.
Wow.
And the craziest part is that he was unknowingly working for the CIA as part of the Iran-Contra affair.
That is wild.
It's a mind-blowing story that really speaks to the complexities of society and the interconnectedness of different worlds, and it challenges those stereotypes about tennis being an elite sport.
Right, because people think of it as this country club.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the common perception. But Rogan and Kosta pointed out, all you really need to play tennis is a flat surface, a racket, and a ball.
Yeah.
And they shared stories of top players who actually started out playing on dirt courts with makeshift nets. So it's not about the fancy equipment or the exclusive clubs. It's about the passion and the dedication.
And they talked about how Serena and Venus Williams
Right?
really changed the whole landscape of tennis.
Absolutely. Their incredible success broke down so many barriers and inspired countless people. It shows that talent and hard work can overcome any obstacle, and it expanded the idea of who could excel in this sport.
Totally.
And then they kind of moved on to the whole idea of physicality in sports.
Right.
And Kosta was talking about how he was naturally good at tennis,
Yep.
but he really struggled with DJing.
And that's so interesting because some things just come naturally to people.
Right. And other things you have to work really hard at, and it's not always obvious which will be which.
Totally. And then they started talking about height and reach advantage.
In sports like tennis and boxing, and they used the example of Deontay Wilder.
The boxer.
Right? This guy is an amazing knockout artist, and what's remarkable is that he's often smaller than his opponents.
And he still knocks them out.
It's incredible. His whole fighting style is built around landing that one devastating punch. And they talked about his knockouts of Luis Ortiz.
Yeah.
And how sudden and brutal they were. It's like he just waits for that perfect moment and then unleashes this incredible force
And they were talking about the effect of a hard hit.
on a fighter.
Yeah.
The disorientation, the loss of coordination, and Kosta shared his own experience of being knocked out in a kickboxing match.
Oh, wow.
He was describing how his legs just gave out, and it's like this really strange sensation where your body just shuts down. And it really underscores the violence of these sports and the risks that these athletes are taking.
And it made me think about how knockouts are perceived in different sports.
Right, because in boxing, there's this system of standing counts.
Right.
So if you get knocked down, the referee gives you time to recover.
Yeah.
But in MMA, if you get hurt, your opponent can just keep attacking you on the ground.
And sometimes the referee
It'll
will...
stop the fight soon enough.
Right. And it can be really brutal.
It can be. And they talked about some really intense finishes in both sports where a fighter who was clearly compromised just kept taking damage.
Right.
And they specifically mentioned the flying knee,
Oh, yeah.
this incredibly powerful but risky technique.
Right.
And they talked about John Jones
Yeah.
and how he used a flying knee to win a title.
And how that was a...
Highlight reel knockout.
But then they also talked about...
The fight between Fedor and Arlovsky.
Yeah, and Arlovsky got knocked out by...
A flying knee gone wrong. And it's a reminder that those high-risk, high-reward techniques can backfire spectacularly.
Right.
And then they shifted the conversation to grappling
Right.
and the importance of the tap-out in MMA,
Right.
which is this really crucial concept
Yeah.
that a lot of people might not understand. It's basically a way for a fighter to say, I give up,
Yeah.
to avoid serious injury.
Right.
And they talked about fighters who've disregarded the tap out and the consequences of those actions, like Paul Harris.
Who was known for holding submissions for too long.
Yeah, he had a reputation for being kind of a jerk.
Right.
And he ended up getting released from the UFC because of his behavior.
And then there's that whole thing about pride.
Right, because it takes a lot of humility
Yeah.
to tap out, especially when you've trained so hard and you want to win.
And they talked about instances where fighters refused to tap,
And ended up getting seriously hurt.
like Frank Mir breaking his arm.
Yeah, that was a gruesome injury.
And then they transitioned into talking about commentary and how important it is
To be present.
to be present and engaged.
Especially during those high-stakes fights.
And Rogan talked about his experience commentating on professional pool,
Right. He brings his own understanding of the game to the commentary.
which makes it so much more interesting to listen to.
Exactly. And it's like that with anything. If you have a deep knowledge of the subject you're talking about, it comes across in your commentary.
And they had to mention pool movies,
Of course.
and The Hustler was the clear favorite.
Over The Color of Money,
Right.
which is not surprising.
And then they kind of touched on the world of racket sports.
Beyond tennis,
Yes.
like paddle tennis,
Right.
which is this growing sport.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
And they were contrasting it with pickleball.
Which is so popular.
Yeah, it's everywhere these days. And they were joking about Kid Rock being a big pickleball fan.
Of course he is.
And it's interesting how these different racket sports appeal to different people.
Right.
Like tennis has this long history and this kind of elitist image, whereas pickleball is more accessible and less physically demanding. It's like the everyman's racket sport.
And then they kind of moved on to some broader societal observations.
Right.
And Rogan was talking about how he's been surprised by anti-American sentiment
Yeah.
and anti-Canadian sentiment.
Which is interesting because you think of both of those countries as being...
Well-liked,
Yeah.
but I guess not everybody feels that way.
Right. And it's a reminder that global perspectives can be very different from our own.
Right.
And then they got into a little bit of a discussion about Canadian politics,
Oh, yeah.
which I don't think anybody really understands.
Including Canadians.
Probably not. And then they kind of joked about Canada becoming the 51st state,
Right.
which is a ridiculous idea, but it's funny to think about.
Yeah.
And then they were talking about Greenland.
And how it could potentially become a state.
Yeah, because of its resources and the effects of climate change. And
Right.
they talked about these power metals.
Yeah, like nickel and copper and cobalt.
Yeah, which are crucial for things like batteries and electric vehicles.
Right.
And it made me think about the whole ethical side of mining those metals because a lot of it comes from places where there's child labor. And
Oh.
it's something we should be more aware of as consumers.
Totally. And then they brought up Trump and his interest in buying Greenland.
Yeah, that was a weird time.
And it kind of makes more sense now knowing about the importance of those power metals.
Right. It's not just about the land itself. It's about the resources that are there.
And then they even talked about asteroid mining.
Which sounds like something out of science fiction.
Right.
But it could become a reality in the future.
And then they shifted to the topic of technology.
Right.
And specifically AI.
Which is a huge topic these days.
And there's a lot of concern about the potential impact of AI on society.
Yeah, people are worried about jobs being replaced.
All right.
And the potential for AI to be used for malicious purposes.
And Rogan and Kosta were acknowledging those concerns.
But they also recognize that AI development is inevitable. It's happening all over the world.
And it's moving so fast.
Yeah, and they talked about some of the amazing things that AI can already do, like summarizing websites and translating languages in real time.
It's credible.
But they also talked about the challenges and limitations of AI,
Right.
like bias and inaccuracies.
And they brought up an example of Google's image generation.
Yeah, which had some early problems with bias.
Right.
And it's something that we need to be really careful about as we develop these systems.
And Rogan told a funny story about his Wikipedia page,
Oh, yeah.
saying that he's Greek.
Which is not true.
Right.
But it's a reminder that even seemingly factual information online can be wrong.
And then they got into the whole issue of bots and misinformation on social media.
Yeah, it's a real problem.
And it's getting harder and harder to tell what's real and what's not.
Exactly.
And then they had this really interesting discussion about the idea of submitting to AI.
Like willingly giving up control to a super intelligent machine
Right.
in the hopes that it will create a better world.
And it's kind of a scary thought.
It is, but it's also kind of tempting
Right.
to imagine a world without war, without poverty, without all the problems that we face.
But it's also like, do we really want to give up our freedom and autonomy?
That's the question,
And they even talked about AI running for president.
which is a mind-blowing idea,
I know.
but it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility.
And then they were talking about the power of AI combined with quantum computing.
Which is like exponentially more powerful.
And it's hard to even comprehend what that could mean for the future.
Yeah, it's like we're entering this whole new era of technology.
And they contrasted that with these very essential human skills,
Like plumbing and carpentry, which
Right.
are always going to be needed.
no matter how advanced technology gets.
And it's interesting to think about how the value of those skills might actually increase in a world where everything else is automated.
Right.
And they were talking about how fast technology is changing compared to historical shifts.
Right.
Like it used to take centuries for things to evolve.
Now it's happening in decades or even years.
And it's hard to keep up
And Rogan told a funny story about rats eating car wires.
because the wires are made of soy,
Right.
which is crazy.
And then they got into a whole discussion about rats in New York City.
Oh, yeah. They were talking about how bold they are and
Wow.
how they're even cannibalizing each other.
And how there's so many of them,
And they mentioned the documentary Dark Days.
which is about people living in the subway tunnels.
Yeah, a really powerful film.
And it's a reminder that even in a technologically advanced society,
There are people who are struggling,
right?
and they're often invisible to the rest of us.
And then they kind of brought it back to comedy
Right.
and the importance of connecting with an audience
Yeah, they talked about Bill Burr
and his ability to defend controversial figures,
and still win over the crowd.
which is a real skill.
It is, and it speaks to the power of comedy.
Yeah.
To break down barriers and create common ground.
And they compared it to this Finnish tradition of politicians negotiating in saunas.
Which is an interesting idea.
Yeah.
Like the shared discomfort creates a sense of camaraderie.
And then they were talking about the importance of being present and observant in nature.
Yeah. And Rogan told a story about seeing a deer outside the sauna.
And then they got into a discussion about Lyme disease
And weaponized diseases.
and the dark side of technology.
Yeah, it's like for every positive advancement, there's also the potential for misuse.
Right.
And it's something we need to be constantly aware of.
And then they got into some more everyday annoyances.
Like people not cleaning up after their dogs.
Yeah.
And smokers littering their cigarette butts.
And they got into a whole discussion about whether cigarette filters are biodegradable,
And it turns out they're not.
which is a bummer.
Yeah.
And then they brought up AI again and the issue of inaccuracies and contradictions.
Yeah, it's like AI can be really impressive,
Yeah.
but it's also prone to making mistakes.
And they were debating the value of traditional learning methods
Like writing term papers.
in the age of AI.
Right, because if AI can write a paper for you,
Right.
what's the point of doing it yourself?
But they both agreed that there's still value in the process of learning,
Yeah.
even if the end result isn't perfect.
And Rogan talked about how he's noticed that he loses his train of thought more easily as he gets older.
Oh,
And he talked about the importance of exercise and sauna and sleep.
And they talked about Pete Sampras
Yeah.
and his dedication to sleep.
He was obsessed with it.
Yeah,
And it's a reminder that sleep is crucial for cognitive function.
absolutely.
And they talked about creatine
Right.
and how it can potentially help with sleep deprivation.
Which is interesting.
Yeah.
And they also talked about how dehydration and fatigue can affect decision-making.
And they were joking about those couch fans who criticize athletes. Like they think it's so easy to perform at a high level.
And they talked about the challenges of parenting while sleep-deprived,
Yeah.
which is something a lot of people can relate to. And Rogan talked about how he always tries to exercise after a flight.
To get his energy back up.
And then they kind of circled back to the importance of shared experiences and community.
Yeah, Rogan was talking about how excited he was to hit with the University of Texas tennis team.
And how much he loves his comedy club in Austin.
Yeah, he's really proud of that club.
And he talked about how it was inspired by the Comedy Store in L.A.
Yeah, the Comedy Store is like a legendary club.
And he talked about getting advice from Louis C.K.
About designing the space.
And they talked about the importance of good sound and a comfortable environment
Yeah.
for the comedians in the audience.
And they talked about the history of the LA comedy scene.
And how the Comedy Store has been this kind of clubhouse for comedians.
And Rogan talked about how Ron White encouraged him to open a club in Austin.
And how Austin is this great central location
Yeah.
for comedians.
And it's really cool to see how the Austin comedy scene has grown.
Right.
It's like this really supportive community.
And Rogan talked about how his club has this really unique atmosphere.
Yeah. With Mae West's couch and Rodney Dangerfield's notes.
And Lenny Bruce's microphone.
Yeah.